Thank you for joining us, those who are present in person and those who are following us online. This is a special event for the Tocqueville program, which is co-sponsored by the Ostrom Workshop and the Department of Political Science. I'm Aurelian Craiuțu. I lead with Les Lankowski the small Tocqueville program here. And it is a rare opportunity for us to bring together two distinguished Tocqueville scholars, probably the most proeminent Tocqueville scholar in the United States, Olivier Zunz, and Professor Richard Boyd. Olivier is the author, most recently, The Man Who Understood Democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, published by Princeton University Press, and Richard, which is political theory at Georgetown, is the author, editor of the Cambridge Companion Democracy in America, published by Cambridge University Press also in 2022. So when we thought about bringing the two together, we thought of celebrating their achievements. These are two outstanding new contributions to the Tocqueville scholarship. We are very proud to be able to celebrate them together today. But we also invited the two scholars here to talk with us about what are the Tocqueville's lessons for us today. And to that effect, we invited a third speaker today, who is our very own doctoral student, Guangyu Zhao from Indiana University. And we asked him to talk about Tocqueville's relevance for China today, because really Tocqueville's ideas have a global resonance today. So this is a three-person panel. We will start on time. We will give 20 minutes to each speaker to make a presentation about their point of view. Then we'll open up for the conversation, and our speakers will have a chance to talk again in the second half of the event. Without further ado, thank you to all of you for being with us today here, and thank you to our speakers who came all the way to Bloomington to celebrate Tocqueville's relevance today. So please join me in welcoming them to Bloomington.
Thank you. Thank you, Aurelian, for that very nice, kind introduction. And thanks to the Ostrom Center and all of you for joining, both remotely as well as here in person. I guess, Aurelian, if I understand my challenge here, my charge, is to say a little bit about the composition of the volume, what it was that I had in mind in designing this volume, how perhaps it differs from some of the other works out there about Tocqueville, what the distinctive contribution would be. So I'll try to jump in and without simply going through and giving an overview of the volume, maybe share a little bit of my thinking in terms of how I brought it together and what I was trying to accomplish with it. I guess in part, the way the book came together was really dictated by the nature of the series at Cambridge University Press. I think it's similar, of course, in the ambitions of Olivier with his outstanding new biography, in that I'm obviously trying to speak to Tocqueville's relevance to contemporary issues about democracy and America, his relevance to our own age. And yet the series mandate isn't so much about offering a comprehensive view of the thinking of a particular figure as it is about timeless texts and the way those texts themselves continue to speak to our concerns. So it really is about how to understand this one text, Democracy in America, arguably Tocqueville's greatest and most influential work. I guess that mandate makes the job in some ways easier, in other ways more difficult. I suppose it's easier in the sense that it narrows the parameters. One doesn't have to worry in putting together an edited collection about, do we need something on Tocqueville's memoirs on pauperism, or what about the Ancien Regime, or what did he think about 1848? Some of these issues come in around the periphery, but in putting it together, one can, I think, be much more focused. However, I guess it complicates the task in that a lot of weight is being borne by this one single work, published in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1840, written by a 20-something Tocqueville, and it may or may not fully represent his mature political thinking. I think that may be one of the differences I gather between this work and Olivier's work, that you're much more concerned about his subsequent political career, the way in which his life, his biography unfolded after the second volume had been sent off to press. So I guess in terms of how to organize a book like this, I really had 4 broad, even generic questions in mind. Broadly speaking, what are some things one would want to know about any important book that would help educated lay readers, as well as scholarly specialists, better understand this particular book? So there are really four very broad generic questions that shape the organization and substance of this edited collection. The first issue, and I guess this really is the first section, not coincidentally, of the book, has to do with sources and influences. And again, I think speaking generically, one thing that one might appeal to try to understand any book or any artistic production, whether it's Hobbes's Leviathan or Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice or a Picasso painting, would be what are the major influences on the author? Right? What were they thinking? Or what were other things that had shaped their vision of how this thing would come together? So again, a big part of the book's concerned with taking up this question of what, if anything, might have inspired Tocqueville's composition of DIA, and as well as influenced his reactions to American democracy. The task in the case of Tocqueville, though, is especially complicated. And we amongst ourselves over the past day or so have kicked around the dilemma that all Tocqueville scholars face. Unfortunately, we have a very, very poor and incomplete record of Tocqueville sources, not just for Democracy in America, but elsewhere. He's notoriously reticent in citing books that he was reading or other things that he would have drawn upon in composing this account. We know very little, at least firsthand in the book itself, about sources, right? Interlocutors, the hundreds of people he might have spoken to during his voyage, both formally and informally. There, and I think a name or two mentioned here. There are, in terms of major American sources, there is a reference to Jefferson, I think the notes in the state of Virginia. The Federalist is mentioned. There's a reference to the Mayflower Compact, Cotton Mather, but not a whole lot to go on, right? Not like a well-researched, well-documented scholarly article with lots of footnotes where we could connect the dots. And so there is a problem kind of filling in the blanks, right? Intuiting what it was that he was thinking that would have led him to react in this particular way. I think the task also of understanding Tocqueville's influences more generally has been complicated, not so much by an absence of evidence, but perhaps by an overemphasis on or even misdirection in terms of sources. There is the famous quip that Tocqueville gave to his lifelong friend, Louis de Kergolay, that there were three figures with whom he communed daily: Montesquieu, Pascal, and Rousseau. And so thinking about how to organize this book, given the extraordinary amount that's already been written connecting Montesquieu and Tocqueville, given, I guess, to a lesser extent, more recently, the significant numbers of things connecting to Pascal and to religion, I guess to a lesser extent, still there are things that suggest there are Rousseauian influences here. I didn't want to commission full chapters, essentially just rehashing, recapitulating things that were already there in the existing literature. So I tried to organize this issue of influences and sources a little bit differently. We have three chapters starting off that more broadly think about the environment or broad relationships to influences. The first chapter by Ryan Patrick Hanley raises the question of Tocqueville's relationship to the Enlightenment, to a number of sources, 17th and 18th century sources. And rather than, I thought this is an interesting way in which the problem is addressed here, rather than saying that Tocqueville is indeed an Enlightenment thinker, or is he a counter-Enlightenment or a critic of Enlightenment, the way some people have even suggested, what sort of Enlightenment thinker is he? And I think Hanley's very ingenious answer to this is that he's a moderate Enlightenment thinker. And so Hanley tries to read Democracy in America through the lens of the Scottish Enlightenment, and I think puts forward some really unique suggestions about potential similarities, if not even influences, between especially Adam Smith and Democracy in America. Second chapter by our very own Professor Creutu addresses force forward to the 19th century and thinks about Tocqueville in light of his milieu, his immediate milieu, the so-called generation of 1820, thinkers, I guess, born largely after or around the time of the French Revolution, coming of age in the 1820s, figures like Theodore Geoffroy, Charles de Musat, figures who are known to be associated with Tocqueville and yet haven't fully been connected in terms of the concerns and sensibilities that they all in that generation shared about the emergence of democracy as a political and social condition. And then finally, one of the real perennial issues, something maybe that's generated more debate and attention than anything else, is the way Tocqueville's aristocratic lineage may have shaped his visit to America, his impressions of America, as well as his broad attitudes toward democracy. And I think there's also a very unique chapter by Richard Avermenko, thinking about not just his aristocratic upbringing, but his reaction, his and Beaumont's reaction to a novel by, I think she's a German novelist, Sophie von La Roche, who wrote an interesting novelette about fugitive emigres from the French Revolution, a couple who fled to Lake Oneida in America. And in Avramenko's reconstruction, this was a novel that fascinated both of them. They read it as children and in some ways shaped their itinerary during the voyage, as well as the search to find some remnants of aristocracy in America, not to recreate aristocracy, which I think they realized already was a foregone conclusion, but to find some way of drawing upon remnants of it, some functional surrogate in America. So again, different ways of addressing this notion of influence. The second issue is that of receptions, right? So in addition to how books came into being, how were books received, right? A way of understanding something about a book might be to focus in on how other people have read that book and read it quite differently in very different contexts and milieus. So I think, again, among the things that distinguish this particular volume, there is really a disproportionate concern with receptions. First, the magnitude of DIA's influence, right? The way in which this book has, across the world for centuries, continued to influence people and been drawn upon for solutions and criticism and prescriptions. And also the variety, right, that figures in different contexts look at and identify different things in democracy in America that they identify with and they believe are of political use given their circumstances. In the introduction, I tried to briefly sketch out the French reception, how it was that the book was hailed, I guess, albeit with some ambivalence across the political spectrum in his own France. In England, how interestingly both conservatives and Tories appealed to democracy in America. This cataclysmic vision of the tyranny of the majority that was invoked against the reform bills at the time. And yet also his main friends and champions in England were liberals, right? People on the political left. And then likewise in the United States, the way in which people reacted in terms of how other voyagers had seen the United States. I fast forward to Eastern Europe and the way in which democracy in America in the 20th century served as a kind of resource for civil society, appeals to civil society, the idea of democratic transitions. And then the chapters themselves, I commissioned a very excellent chapter on Latin American receptions of democracy in America, reception of democracy in America in Japan and China, how the Frankfurt School used and abused some of Tocqueville's ideas in his critiques of mass society. And then I guess the part that I will say just a little bit about this now, but circle back around to the very end, something of special concern to me is how in the United States, we've been left with these very, very different, almost mutually incompatible ways of reading either the left Tocqueville or the right or conservative Tocqueville. I think we've come to think of Tocqueville in the United States, and this may be an artifact of our disproportionate emphasis on democracy in America as being a thinker of the right, to the point where historian Michael Kamen famously declared Tocqueville lost to the left. Yet, as Bob Gannett in this volume suggests, and I think a very, very revealing, very, very historically nuanced chapter, there's also in the United States a very influential tradition on the left of appealing to Tocqueville, influencing community organizing, Saul Alinsky, social activism, civil society thinking, left communitarianism, all of which have drawn quite explicitly on Tocqueville's ideas. Thirdly, again, beyond this motion of receptions, there's a question that may not be operative in the case of most works that we confront, but I think is especially operative in the case of Tocqueville, and that's this issue of genre. Like, just in a crude sense, like, what kind of book is this? Like, Moby Dick, right? It's a complex work, but it's a novel, right? And you could read it as a work of economy, you could read it as other things, but it's a novel. It's not so obvious what Democracy in America is, right? What genre does this work belong to? It's commonly read as a work of political science, read often as a work of philosophy, sociology, sometimes a work of American history. Is it all of those? Is it none of those? Is there some way in which some of these disciplinary labels fit the work better than others? I tried to invite people in this volume to think about it outside of some of the common ways of reading it. So we have a wonderful chapter thinking about Democracy in America as a work of literature, looking at the literary vignettes and the imagery that Tocqueville seems to use to generate a sense of moral identification with the dilemmas of slavery and race. Some economists, Rachel Baer and Virgil Storr, look at the work as a work of political economy, reading the formal economics and some of the observations about how politics and economics intersect with one another. As a work of constitutional interpretation, offering a certain reading of the US Constitution, and one interesting that differs from the more authoritative reading we find in, say, the Federalist Papers. even perhaps thinking about the work as a work of theology, or at least one that has theological overtones, as Josh Mitchell, my colleague, suggests in his chapter. So again, I think this is a real issue. This book has, no exaggeration, given birth to entire disciplines. I don't think it's such an exaggeration to say that Tocqueville was in many ways the first sociologist, that maybe in some ways Democracy in America was the first work of American political development. And yet I think question that might emerge is what is lost or what is gained by thinking about the work, or as being somehow exhausted by simply those contributions. And then finally, in terms of the big issues, the way of organizing the volume, I think Olivier and I concur that Tocqueville, properly understood, still has much to teach us about contemporary American democracy. Yet there's a tendency, especially in the case of a titanic figure like Tocqueville, to assume because he's a genius, and this is a classic book, that he must have gotten everything right. We have to take everything that Tocqueville says about America at face value. I kind of refer to this as the Tocqueville fallacy. America must be like this because Tocqueville said it was like this. Protean books like DIA are easily used and abused. And I think even the history of its reception across time and across politics should warn us of this. So in the latter section of the book, I didn't plan it to come out this way, but it emerged that three of the scholars I had on the one hand, and at the same time, strongly affirm the relevance of the book to major issues of our day, gender, race, and inequality, while at the same time raising questions about the sufficiency of his approach and answers, right? So he's relevant, he's helpful, he's useful, and yet I think all three would say he just got some things straight out wrong. So I think all those, I could get into the details of that, but I'll leave that for Q&A if people want to follow up. So I guess I've deliberately left aside one of the questions, maybe most important question, what do I think the book actually says, or what does it mean to get Tocqueville right? And I guess that's the aspiration of every chapter, but it's also an aspiration that's complicated by something I've already observed, namely, how does one get a book right when a book like Democracy in America has demonstrably been read in so many widely different ways, right? And there are almost a million different Tocquevilles, depending on a million different contexts and a million different readers. So let me say, by way of concluding, this is something I tried to navigate in my own chapter. My own contribution to the volume is titled Tocqueville's Conservatism and the Conservatives' Tocqueville. And it's concerned about, first of all, trying to stabilize a meaning of the book, right? Trying to identify some things and some arguments, at least, that might not, at the end of the day, fully capture Tocqueville's political orientation, but I think are nonetheless distinctive, identifiable, conservative impulses in the work itself. I mentioned the idea of institutional path dependency, right? That foundings matter and are enduring in terms of their causal significance. He affirms the virtues of civil society. He endorses a public, if informal, role for religion, criticizes many of the cultural pathologies he associates with democracy and democratic culture, rejects radical egalitarianism, and he critiques centralization and soft despotism. So it seems to me that, well, these are not perhaps unique to conservatism. They are in some way distinctively conservative dispositions. And this, I think, are the arguments in DIA that have drawn conservative readers in his own day, as well as in our day. On the other hand, I guess this is the other side of the tension I'm trying to navigate here, the lesson of my chapter and the volume of the whole is that while these conservative impulses or arguments, while undeniable, do not exhaust his writings and do not exhaust DIA. And I think it's entirely legitimate that people on the left find other arguments in the work that are, for them, inspiring of sensibilities that are much more egalitarian and progressive. The thing that makes this matter of interpretation and the way in which the book can be cited as cross purposes is not just there's a left Tocqueville, there's a right Tocqueville. One of the fascinating things is the way Tocqueville himself was cited by different parts of the left, right? He exposes some of the tensions or fissures within the left. The one case that I spend some time talking about is the way in which Tocqueville was cited, especially during the war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, as on the one side, providing a kind of warrant for regime building. The notion that democracy is destined to unfold providentially everywhere in the world, and the United States has a specific vocation in bringing or disseminating democracy everywhere in the world. So there were neocons who appealed to this aspect of Tocqueville and cited Tocqueville as part of the project of Iraq and Afghanistan. On the other hand, conservatives who said, wait a minute, Tocqueville clearly says that you can't simply transplant political institutions, you can't copy the governments of other nations, that their cultures are unique, that liberty or democracy are things that have to emerge spontaneously and indigenously. Each nation must find democracy in its own way. And so again, I think legitimately both of those arguments and impulses are there in the work itself. I have some thoughts about which is the real Tocqueville, but I'll hold those off for another moment. So in conclusion, I hope that these comments, and especially the volume itself as it emerged, help draw attention to the ongoing importance of this monumental book. The fact it's been a political lodestar across the centuries, continues to spark new insights, speaks to its status as one of the most important books ever written about democracy and about America. Thank you.
Olivier, you have 20 minutes.
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me to talk a little bit about the biography I just wrote. I want to thank Michael Waldman to be here today because he gave an extensive comment on the book in Charlottesville, and it's great. Delighted to see Rob Schneider here from our Michigan years together, and especially Rob's mentor, David Bien, was very influential in my own thinking about Tocqueville, greatest historians of the 18th century, and helped me with François Furet at the time really read Tocqueville. So I've been living with Tocqueville pretty much all my adult life since I met François Furet in 1968 in Paris, and so when I began reading Tocqueville with him. But enough for my own biography. I want to say something about the circumstances which prompted me to write the biography, and note some aspects of Tocqueville's personality to which I paid special attention, outlining his seminal contribution to democracy and liberal thought. Now, I had never written a biography before, so it was something of a challenge. I mean, it's a special genre of history, and so I was actually challenged by that too. It was sort of interesting. Many of my friends said, had been one of the founders of the Tocqueville Review and the Tocqueville Society, had been involved in Tocqueville scholarship pretty much all my life, but I always describe myself as a Sunday Tocquevillian. It was kind of a sideline, not something I was going to do. I didn't do any big work, just small essays, some better than others. And finally, he did the Library of America translation of Democracy in America, Art Goldhammer's translation, published Tocqueville's notebooks and letters from America, and an English edition, also translated by Art Goldhammer, published the recollections of the 1848 revolution. And some friends kept telling me, no, you know so much about this guy, you really need to write his biography. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. I'll try to do that. So that's what I did. But I've set out to understand not just Tocqueville's ideas, like everybody else. This is a big challenge, big ideas, need to confront them. But I wanted in the biography to understand how Tocqueville arrived at those ideas, how he developed them. There's something really mysterious about this 25-year-old who shows up in America from an aristocratic background. Everybody around him is loyal to the Bourbons, kings. There's no Democrats around. They all hate democracy. Equality is a bad word. And he's the only one of his family who is interested in democracy, goes to America to figure out whether he could ever live in one. And he's 25 years old, doesn't know much of anything really. He hardly speaks any English. He worked on English during the sea voyage, read some political economy. And he ends up with a book we're still reading and discussing and framed one of the main questions of modern history, the relationship between equality and liberty, and how we should balance the two. I mean, it just was, it's remarkable. For years at Virginia, I ran a little small undergraduate seminar with 10, 12 students in it every year, reading Democracy in America. And students were stunned by the fact that this kid, who was only 3 years older than they were at the time, could again, from this monarchist family, had no real idea what he was going to see, emerged from a short period, 9.5 months in the country, in 1831-32, with a powerful new understanding of modern history as this vital struggle between liberty and equality, and produced a work that has helped Americans and many others around the world think of themselves and their society anew. So as a biographer, there was something really important to say, well, how come? How come? You know, as Richard just said, in Democracy in America, Tocqueville is largely silent on his sources. He mentions a few sources here and there. He talked to 200 all in the United States, about 200, and there's only one mentioned by name in a footnote. Edward Livingston, Jackson's Secretary of State, had been minister to France before. And I think I know the reason why he's in there, but it's only speculative. I think Bill really was counting on Livingston to promote the book here, just the way Chateaubriand had promoted it in France. That didn't work out. I think Livingston had no interest in doing so. In the end, Tocqueville didn't need him, but I think that was probably there. Anyway, in the book itself, Tocqueville was content to say that he had done his homework, the reader should trust him. But to know more, as I was reading along with the students, I followed the lead of a small group of scholars who had delved into Tocqueville's papers. And it was really by good fortune to begin my query as the editions of Tocqueville's complete works, of complete, Gallimard, was slowly nearing completion. Now, the project began in 1951 to publish Tocqueville's papers, still held by the family. 72 years later, the project was finally completed with 32 volumes. Now, the 32 volumes are not just the main books, Democracy in America, the Ancien Régime and the French Revolution, both of which were published in Tocqueville's lifetime, the recollections of the 1848 Revolution that were published posthumously, but also all of Tocqueville's parliamentary papers, because he was a representative in the French Chamber, elected in 1839. He published volume 2 in 1840, saying, I must finish this book. I will kill it or it will kill me, but he finally did it. And there's a big discussion in the Tocqueville literature as to whether it's one book or two books. And I actually think it doesn't really matter how you answer the question. Tocqueville thought it was one book, and that's why he never wanted to write an introduction to the second volume, even though it is in effect kind of two different books, one closer to the travel, and one much more theoretical in nature. But it was my good fortune to have at my disposal the complete works, because Tocqueville's handwriting is impossible, it's long. So I owe great debt to the 20-some scholars who over 70 years, nobody was in a hurry, obviously, transcribed these notes. And Françoise Bellonio, who's at the time publishing the collection, shared with me everything that had been transcribed but yet unpublished. So she was very generous with that. And it's helped me a great deal. And then I read and closely prepared with my friend Al Goldhammer, who translated them, an edition of Tocqueville and Beaumont's extensive travel diaries and letters home to family and friends and related material. And we say Tocqueville is silent on his sources, but in fact, it's hundreds of pages of notes, not so much reading notes. Tocqueville there's a real problem about Tocqueville as a reader. He had moments where he read a lot, and moments, but in his youth, he hasn't really read all that much. He was mostly reading pretty light literature, more or less, you know, La Bruyère, La Rochefoucauld, people, but yeah, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Pascal, I think he read them closely, for sure. Kierkegaard, his friend, was a great interlocutor, but Tocqueville at some point, in reading some books, in, you know, as already he was in his 40s and working on different topics, felt ashamed that he had never read them before. Described himself as feeling a bit like Marshal Soult, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs and learning geography when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs. And then all of a sudden he had, you know, had to catch up with his reading. But nonetheless, he realized, he took really extensive notes on the landscape, on his conversations. He recorded every one of them carefully. He paid very much attention to a lot of details of local life in America. And it was really very interesting to, in a sense, contrast his notes to the book. And you could see, in a sense, that there's a real disconnect between the two. To say, you know, you would expect him to make very significant observations about great transformations of America in places he visited, and he missed completely. Like, for instance, he traveled along the Erie Canal in the summer of 1832, stopped near the canal towns, talked to lots of people in the Albany Regency and the Jacksonians there, moved on, and he never heard of the Second Great Awakening. And he missed evangelical religions completely. And yet, in the book, he has some extraordinary discussions of the role of religion in America and how American democracies managed to combine in a unique way religion and liberty in a way that was inconceivable in France, as the Puritan state were fighting nail every day. So there's a disconnect between observations that are really interesting and a text that is quite different from them. And it shows really the power of intelligence in a way as he put it all together. Now, as I worked on the biography, I sought to understand how Tocqueville developed these ideas, not just only as an intellectual reflecting on the changing world around him, but also as a politician pledged to action and reform. I mean, in the Tocqueville literature, basically the line is, well, he was a great mind, but he was a lousy politician. Well, it doesn't matter whether he was a lousy politician or not. He was a politician. To him, it was very important. He told Kierkegaard and his friend that it was more important to him to be a man of action than a man of letters. And even though he failed in many political reforms that he wanted to say, still he had the idea that he had it in him to have a unique synthesis of thought and action. So that was really an important thing to do. Tocqueville also was very conscious of living in a special moment in history. He told his British friend, was also his first translator, Henry Reeve, that because aristocracy was already dead when his life began, he was born in 1805, and democracy didn't yet exist. He was, as he put it, perfectly balanced between past and future. Well, I think he was not, but he thought he was. And he thought to become an important player in the transformation between past and future. And indeed, he experienced two bloody revolutions in France, first in 1830, with the coming of the Orléans regime and the constitutional monarchy. And then in 1848, which instituted the republic he joined. He was briefly imprisoned in what Karl Marx famously named the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon's Napoleon's nephew orchestrated his elevation from president of the Second Republic to emperor of the Second Empire. Tocqueville ran several electoral campaigns. He was elected to the chamber in 1839. He took on great causes in his political life: the abolition of slavery in the French colonies, the rehabilitation of criminals following his prison investigation in the US. That was the official reason for the travel, for the trip. The defense of church-run schools, Catholic schools, as an alternative to state schools, and leave them alone, have a freedom of teaching. Legal and constitutional reform, fighting for bicameralism in 1848, he failed on that. Intense work on all of these issues influenced his thinking on democracy, and actually he told his brother that holding office gave him, he otherwise lost in theory, a chance to handle the most precious interests of the population. So I think we should really think of Tocqueville as a man of action as much as a man of writing, even though we don't remember him as a statesman. His life in letters and politics were not separate activities, but interrelated means to turn greater equality into a source of liberty, equality generating liberty for a larger number of citizens. And so as a biographer, I really wanted to bring that out. It's not an analysis of the text, but just a biography. He wanted to see a society where individual and general interests become one, combined. And in the US, he witnessed a phenomenon unknown to him, in which individuals can serve or strive to serve the common good by satisfying their personal ambitions. He didn't know that existed, and that combined the two. He labeled the practice self-interest properly understood. This is a well-known part of Tocqueville's contribution to democratic theory. And he jotted it in his notebooks. That's one of the things that really connect between the notebooks and the book itself. Ancient republics operated on the principle that the particular interest was to be sacrificed to the general good. Was to be a good person in ancient society, you had to leave your self-interest behind and work for the common good. But the principle of this republic seems to me to require the particular interest to serve the general interest, a sort of refined and intelligent egotism appears to be the axis about which the whole machine will be. Tocqueville went later to argue that self-interest was actually a positive development for civilization for a pretty simple reason, is that self-interest was in much greater supply than virtue in society. So you better make use of it, you know? So one couldn't be more tolerant of human weakness. Tocqueville became an ardent defender of democracy, but he was alert to its weaknesses. He was susceptible to its, he understood demagoguery, despotism, violence, revolutionary upheaval. He has lost many relatives to the guillotine, grandparents, great-grandparents, uncles and aunts during the terror. And he knew Tocqueville was always thinking comparatively. He traveled, and that's a very important aspect of his work and of his thinking, the comparison. Why Democracy in America is not just a book on America, it's a comparative political theory, including a lot of thinking about England and France. Combined, it's all said in the name of America, but it's not the case. It's an amalgam of all these things. He toured England several times, Ireland, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Algeria, worked comparatively, but he was never clear about the terms of comparisons. He would say things, but never tell you how it came out in his head. For example, he relied on British examples of industrial exploitation to describe the danger of an emerging industrial aristocracy. But in America, he never paid any attention to industry. He never even looked at the textile mills in Lowell or anywhere else. It all came out of England, and he did of Manchester and Birmingham and other places. He reflected on the French state's repression of associations to hail the virtue of American associations. But it was really as a response to the French state repressing political associations. And I give many examples of this in the biography, and this is all part of his strategy to guide democracy towards the common good. It doesn't matter whether it happened in America or not. It was all about what democracy should be. So he kind of amalgamated these different things in his head, and used them as building blocks of a larger theoretical construct. And what Tocqueville missed in America didn't necessarily affect his judgment because of this constant comparison between different countries. I just mentioned that he missed the evangelical Protestantism altogether, and yet he said most important things about the role of religion in America. It's a combination of the spirit of religion and freedom. So Tocqueville, in a sense, grand theory of democracy in volume 2 was clearly more invention than observation. And one person who really saw it better than anybody else was John Stuart Mill, the keenest critic at the time, who said it in so many words. And the wonder is that Tocqueville's inventions ended up more often than not resembling reality more than his observations in his notebooks. Now, Tocqueville participated in all of the great controversy of his time, in the halls of government, in the chambers, in the academies, the French Academy, the Academy of Law and Political Science, in the salons, in the newspapers. At one point he ran a newspaper. I know I'm running late, but give me another 5 minutes or so, because I won't be back here tomorrow. So I set out to retrace these multiple commitments in the book as his connection to all of these milieus really make his life extremely interesting. Again, Tocqueville died at age 53, but he was here when he was 25. And then he had his political career. So in the process of this political career, Tocqueville kept revisiting the same issues time and again. It's interesting how his idea is really kind of a man of one great idea, the relationship between equality and liberty, and keep pushing and pushing and pushing. So he went very deep and deeper and deeper. And he grew with this idea in important ways. Now, one is often struck in the stylistic differences between democracy in America and the Ancien Regime and the Revolution. Democracy in America is a young man's book. It's a great book, it's a brilliant book, but it's a mess. It's repetitive, it's poorly constructed. You have 2 chapter pages and 2-page chapters and 50-page chapters. You have it's brilliant, but it's best. If you look at Ancien Regime, Revolution, it's a perfectly calibrated little book. There's not an extra word, it's not an extra sentence. It's a masterpiece of competition. And you can see his trajectory is working more and more as a better and better writer, and he has now been considered to be one of the best writers of his generation and across the ages. Tocqueville died before he had a chance to produce a sequel to the Regime and the Revolution. He left us only with reading notes, a few drafts of his planned history of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire, but one can only imagine the brilliant analytical narrative it would have been. Described the cycle of freedom, the revolution and independence, and collapse into despotism, and he diagnosed as a French malady. So, as a writer and a politician, Tocqueville attempted, against the odds, to operate a singular blend of theory and practice. His life was a mix of political theory and policy making, and I try to show how this worked out in his biography, stage by stage. There was plenty, therefore, in Tocqueville's life to keep the biographer busy. But there was more, and I want to finish on this quickly, Aurelian. Tocqueville had a genuine gift for lasting friendship. He was shy and diffident. He was in poor health most of his life and fought with this. He was never at ease with chambers in the colleagues. Many of them didn't remember their names. People thought of him as being, cold and distant, but he forged very deep friendships sustained by correspondence over a long period of time. And the galaxy of correspondence included many of his American informants, Charles Sumner, the historian Jared Spark, the first history professor at Harvard, Francis Kleber, the political philosopher, British friends, John Stuart Mill, British economist, Nassau Senior, some of the most important men in France, but also his childhood friends, his family members, even though they were legitimists and he had moved to another direction politically, remained loyal to them in friendships. Correspondence was a daily activity. And these letters are beautiful. And of the 32 volumes of complete works, 18 volumes are volumes of letters. 19. 19?
I checked.
You checked. Okay, well, I stand corrected. These letters played a very important role in my work as a biographer because I came to share Tocqueville's emotions. I even found myself worrying about how he would respond to this letter or that letter, or how he'd frame this argument. I got caught into it, which probably was a good thing since I was going to write this biography. And I worried about his responses to events. But the main thing these letters did to me was to convince me of Tocqueville's integrity in expressing his convictions, in voicing his doubts, of which there were many. And this gave a moral quality to the life I tried to write. Which I may not have perceived otherwise, if not in following correspondence with all his friends. Of course, I made judgment calls. I believe the weight of the evidence shows Tocqueville passionately committed to democracy, regardless of his many doubts. So I resist the part of the literature that wants to turn him into a closet monarchist and so on. I won't get into that, but I see him deeply influenced by the American example throughout his life, and not just providing democracy in America, but in his political life and after, and in his work in writing the Constitution of the Second Republic and so on. Tocqueville was haunted by doubt. That was in his nature, but he channeled his anxieties into a creative form. He knew how to do that. You can be crippled by anxieties, or you can turn them into something better, which he knew how to do. He was always looking for the better formulation. He was respecting complexity. He knew how to change his mind when needed. So I think Tocqueville, as we've said before here today, still is alive in our mind as we read him. He knew democracy to be fragile, resting on a collective will, sustained by a hard to acquire habit of liberty. We can only be struck by some of the similarities between his concern and ours: fear of extremists taking a hold of power, economic inequality, limiting opportunity, lawlessness, destroying trust. But at the same time, this life has the power to inspire us, to sustain our democracy in a feasible way. Remembering that he developed these ideas partly for their beauty, but mostly as tools of human improvement. Sorry for.
Thank you.
Thank you to Aurelian for organizing this event and making me join the panel with these two distinguished scholars. And thanks for coming today. First, like I'm a guy from China, letting me talk about Tocqueville. It sounds maybe some justification, and I think the justification is already in the new volume edited by Professor Boyd. Like compared to the previous 2006 Cambridge Companion to Tocqueville, this volume actually offers some updated landscape about like Tocqueville's global relevance. Like we have a chapter by Professor James Schleifer on Tocqueville in Japan and China. My presentation today is partly built on that, and also I try to add some new facts I found based on my research. So, so my talk is about like how Tocqueville's ideas are relevant to contemporary China, and how some Chinese intellectuals employ Tocqueville's ideas for various theoretical and political reasons. And first of all, some of you might already know that there was kind of a Tocqueville fever or Tocqueville fashion in 2012 in China. And the reason was that a top Chinese Communist Party leader, Wang Qishan, recommended reading of the regime and the revolution. So today when I pronounce Chinese name, the surnames comes first as it's done in Chinese. So Wang was a powerful figure at that time. He was in charge of the anti-corruption campaign under Xi Jinping and was an ally of Xi Jinping. So when the news spread, like people got to wonder like what this book's about and who is this author, why Wang recommended it. It's also said that Chinese Premier Li Keqiang also mentioned the old regime at that time. So suddenly Tocqueville was widely discussed in China, and numerous versions of old regime came out. So there have been some scholarly discussion on this phenomenon, like about why these Chinese leaders got interested in Tocqueville and whether they got Tocqueville's ideas right. And one idea of Tocqueville's that clearly spoke to Chinese leaders and also Chinese people's mind was the so-called idea of paradox of reform. In old regime, actually, he mentioned that the most dangerous moment for a bad government was actually the time when it wants to reform, wants to improve itself. So the French Revolution did not break out during the most despotic period under Louis XIV, but it broke out under Louis XVI, already started to promote some liberal reform. So it seems that Wang used Tocqueville to caution the CCP leaders, CCP officials about the risk of social instability in the process of reform. Actually, you could say that old regime actually somehow becomes the CCP leaders' handbook of how to avoid regime collapse during the reform era. So that was one reading. So, but my point today is that Chinese attention to Tocqueville's works should not be surprising, because reform, 改革, revolution, 革命, are actually the main issues in contemporary China in the reform era since Mao Zedong's death. So they are the buzzwords everyone talk about. So a key question in the reform era China is how to advance reform and how to deal with the so-called revolution tradition, the cultural revolution launched by Mao, also the communist revolution in general, and even revolution itself. Like, this discourse of revolution is very key to the leftist thoughts. And actually how to deal with the revolution legacies also Tocqueville's generation's chief political challenges, right? So Chinese scholars have long studied French history as early as they started to know Western ideas, and they were interested in the historiography of the French Revolution. So the older regime, I mean, it naturally fit into this intellectual context, interest in the study of revolution, and it was translated in early 1990s. We can see that Chinese people got to know Tocqueville, and his major text had been translated into Chinese. You can see I offer a display of the list here. One tricky piece is I want to mention here is actually very interesting, like is Tocqueville's diary notes to Sicily when he maybe was very young, like maybe in 1826, with his he traveled to Sicily with his brother. And I don't think this, I checked with two scholars and they said this text has not even been translated into English. And I believe this text, this translation was a pirated translation because no source of the text was mentioned. I still don't know who translated it and why they translated it. So it's very interesting that all kinds of Tocqueville's texts have been translated, and they're also a prolific scholarship in China. So Tocqueville's, I mean, I think as Schleifer discussed in this chapter, in this volume, there are like a couple of Tocquevillian themes actually that are relevant to contemporary China, to modern China, transition to democracy, moral and cultural challenges of modern democracy, right? Like entering democratic age is not like 100% a good thing, like being a democratic man may not be the best form of humanity. So that's also addressed by Tocqueville. Chinese scholars, intellectuals also interested in these topics, and especially how to understand the United States, its democracy, the source of its national strength, and what's the lesson for China. So these Tocquevillian themes are interesting to Chinese scholars. So, and what's more today, I want to say that Tocqueville's idea actually directly entered into the domestic intellectual discourse and the intellectual debates among Chinese scholars. In 1990s, in China, there emerged a ideological debate among Chinese intellectuals who can largely be divided into three camps: the liberals, the new left, and also the so-called neo-authoritarians. And sometimes they are also labeled as neo-conservatives. And I would add nationalists, Chinese nationalists to this camp. So according to some study, all these three groups refer to Tocqueville. And there was the conservative appropriation of Tocqueville. And some of them like refer to Tocqueville to caution against radical transition to democracy. I would say this is understandable because Tocqueville offers a complex picture of modern democracy. But I would say that these conservatives, their reference to Tocqueville are usually very superficial and biased, as we can see in the following case. And a recent case I want to mention is that recently some Chinese nationalists actually also relate Tocqueville's imperialist views to the so-called 20th century imperial competition, maybe between China and the US. I think some of them found some echoes in Tocqueville's imperialist desires or aspirations, sorry. So there was also the progressive, because we could say progressive reading of Tocqueville. Some new left underline the prevailing condition of equality in modern times, and they want to say that the value of equality is very important, and they draw upon Tocqueville. So, of course, there are also the moderate and liberal reading of Tocqueville. Some Chinese liberals especially appreciated Tocqueville's critique of the revolutionary tradition, radicalism, idealism, utopianism. So they want China to like get out of this revolutionary tradition. And some liberals place Tocqueville in the so-called tradition of classical liberalism, and which highlights the value of individual freedom. I'm not sure that this is 100% faithful to Tocqueville's own idea, but it's also understandable. So let's start from an interesting case from the new authoritarian and key figure Wang Hunin. And based on this case, I think you guys can also have a better understanding of what's going on in contemporary China. Wang, actually today, he is often called Xi Jinping's ideology czar. Like he had been in charge of crafting ideological theories for consecutively 3 Chinese leaders, from Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping. Actually, in the recent 20th Party Congress, he was even promoted to number 3 position in the Chinese Communist Party leadership. So he's kind of very powerful now. I would say like he may be the most intriguing, also very mysterious and very dangerous, most dangerous intellectual in China nowadays. But before he entered politics, he used to be a professor of political science at Fudan University in Shanghai. In 1980s, when he was still very young, he was already renowned for his advocacy for governmental centralization and for the importance of maintaining political order in the reform transitional period. And Wang was he was a genius. I think he was an avid reader and a prolific writer. And so because of his wide range of readings, actually, I think he was among the very first to introduce Tocqueville's name to China. And the interesting fact is that he was very fluent in French. He could read French journals and French books and watch French movies. I know that because in 1994, he published an interesting book, which is his diary of that year. And you can see that in that book, he actually mentioned he read Tocqueville's 2 books. And he said that Democracy in America is very influential and worth reading. Later, he also has some connection to Tocqueville because his name was listed among the translators of Raymond Aron's book, The Main Currents in Sociological Thought. In 1999, I don't think he really was involved in the translation. It was mainly done by his assistant and students. But I think probably he already read that book, and which has a long chapter on Tocqueville. What's more interesting is the fact that, and also related to Tocqueville, is that Wang actually wrote a kind of important book on America. I would say this is like a Chinese doctrine of democracy in America. So in 1988, he got a fellowship actually facilitated by American Political Science Association and visited United States for 6 months. He visited more than 20 universities, 30 cities. And later he published his comprehensive observations of America. So it's titled America Against America. And it's a thick book, 400 pages. So I don't think this book really advanced any worthwhile scholarly argument, but it at least shows that Wang was really well informed about the academic works in social sciences. And his observation actually covered many important fundamental aspects of American society and political life at that time. Very different from Tocqueville. This book's message about American democracy and Western democracy is not inspiring or promising at all. So according to Wang, America was haunted with a series of social and cultural crises at that time, such as use of drugs and homelessness, even divorce and racial tensions. American politics is full of partisan struggles, policy dialogues, and he thinks it's really actually dominated by elite corruption. So for Wang, his conclusion is that America's problem is deeply rooted in a radical nihilist culture of individualism at the heart of American liberalism. So this is very different message from Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He actually offers some sporadic reference to democracy in America, but I don't think he really understood Tocqueville's political ideas, especially Tocqueville's normative messages accurately. And there are the 2 authors that matter more more to Wang. That is first Alan Bloom. He dedicated a long section to Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of American Mind. He thinks that Bloom's argument about the cultural decline in American society makes sense to him. And more broadly speaking, Samuel Huntington's book, Political Order in Changing Societies, play an important role in Wang and other authoritarians' argument about why China should not rush to democracy. These new authoritarians shared Huntington's idea that it's mostly important to build institutions and maintain social stability through a strong government over a long period of transition. That's their view about where China should go. So they actually value order much more than human rights. So we would say that Wang came back from America firmly against liberalization. So overall, Tocqueville's complex account of democracy and America, actually, especially the negative aspects, were used by the new authoritarians like Wang to make a case against transition to liberal democracy. And there's also interest in Tocqueville from the left. So there's this interesting figure, Gan Yang. He was a renowned intellectual in 1980s. Later in 1990s, he came to United States studying the PhD program by the Committee on Social Thought at Chicago. And he stayed there 8 or 9 years, left without getting the degree, but that did not prevent Gan from maintaining a leading status among Chinese scholars. He later became a renowned Chinese Straussian and a reformer of liberal arts education. He promoted the model of reading great books, this kind of model of liberal arts education. And the context is that in 1990s, Chinese market economy further developed, and there was a debate between the liberals and the new leftists about political reform, marketization, and cultural transformation around 2000. So among the liberals, interestingly, there was also at the time there was a fashion of Hayek and Austrian economics, and also Isaiah Berlin's idea of negative liberty. Gan Yang, in contrast, he took the new left position in 1990s, and he criticized some Chinese liberals' culture of market competition and their neglect of inequality and social justice. In a 1999 piece titled Liberalism Aristocratic or Democratic, Gan Yang tries to clarify liberalism and its relationship with the value of equality by looking at Tocqueville's works. So he actually identified a so-called Tocqueville question, like how liberalism evolves from the aristocratic form to the democratic form. He agrees with Tocqueville that the equality of conditions is universal and permanent. Therefore, American democracy, not British aristocracy, indicates the trend of modern world. So the lesson for Chinese is that we should embrace democracy. And if we want to criticize democracy, we should still resort to democratic principles instead of being romantic about reviving some aristocratic values. So Gan Yang studied with Francois Furet at Chicago. And I think this piece is perhaps the first accurate overview of Tocqueville's political idea in the Chinese-speaking world. So before I already mentioned that some Chinese liberals in 1990s referred to Tocqueville to criticize the revolutionary tradition, and they want to reintroduce liberal tradition to China. So today, as the end to my presentation, I want to talk about some recent liberal reading of Tocqueville and its implication for China's political development. So there was this piece by Hong Min in Tocqueville Review, Democracy in China, Tocquevillian Reflections. In this article, Professor Chong is a leading Tocqueville scholar in China. He is in charge of translating those Tocqueville texts. So he tries to identify a few trends of social transformation that kind of in reform era China that respond to Tocqueville's analysis of modern democracy, such as like he said that there was this spreading equality in and also individualization in social economic relations in China. There was limited development of civil association or life in China since the opening up and reform. And there was the experiment of local democratic elections at the village and township levels. There was also the return of religious life. So Chong actually discussed like what's the implications for the future of democratization in China and also a transition to liberal democracy. Another piece by a Chinese political theorist, Ci Jiwei, who got his PhD from Oxford and based in Hong Kong. He has a recent book by Harvard Press titled Democracy in China, The Coming Crisis. Ci Jiwei similarly recognized the spreading of equality of conditions in the recent decades. And he stresses that this kind of changing social condition is bringing a coming crisis of legitimacy to the post-Maoist CCP regime. Because according to a Tocquevillian account of political development, the march of democratic social condition has to be matched with the political development of political democracy. So Ci Jiwei tries to, actually, this is weird, he tries to even speak to the CCP regime in an insider tone and try to suggest a so-called prudential agenda of China's democratic reform. So this presentation is kind of an overview, but it's also part of my bigger project about how to use Tocqueville's ideas to analyze Chinese politics today. I think these two authors, I try to critically engage their works in my own study. So I think their like works rightly point to the insufficient legitimacy basis of the current regime, which claim to be based on a so-called developmental or meritocratic model. They think that this model is definitely flawed. But I think both of them might underestimate the CCP's strength in imposing so-called ideological control and violence on Chinese society. So this is an open question. I'm not sure. Like you would say that authoritarian regime is very stable. Maybe it's not that stable. The crash can happen at any minute, right? So this is a question maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. So I think Tocqueville's account is still relevant today. And I think the chief challenge for China is still overcoming despotism and pursuing political liberty. And in this today's global historical context, and the American experience is still relevant there. So these are ongoing challenges for everyone. So I end up with actually Professor Zunz quote there, like this is I think he like conveyed Tocqueville's message, right? Like for Tocqueville, democracy is kind of a constant effort to maintain political liberty, which cannot be taken for granted. So we must have like constant vigilance, redefinition, and enforcement of democracy. So if we want it to survive and prosper. So thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for three excellent presentations. I'd like to have a conversation around the themes here because we have three excellent presentations. I'd like to take three excellent questions at each time so that we give most of you the opportunity to ask or make a comment. And if there are any questions in the chat, we can also use them as well. So the floor is yours. I'd like to, again, engage more than one question at a time so that we give our speakers the possibility of combining their insights. So Eric?
Yeah, on the China thing was very interesting. And I was thinking of another Tocqueville book, the Recollections about the 1848 Revolution. And I wonder what they thought of that, since that was about overthrowing a pro-business king, dubious legitimacy. It was overthrown by a populist revolution and then taken over by the non-charismatic heir of a charismatic guy from 50 years before. I know they like parallels in China. Does that come up at all? Three questions, I think.
I think I see some historical parallels, but you know, at that moment, I think the economic crisis especially in Paris, is very serious. Like the unemployment of the workers, right? They are kind of the driving force of the revolution at that time. So you could say that I agree that because the current regime claims to build their legitimacy on their so-called economic performance and economic prosperity. So what if economic growth slows down, and what would this bring challenge to Chinese regime? I think that's relevant.
Different. I was thinking the parallel is there. Has anybody dared to translate that book, or is it too dangerous?
It's already translated. Yeah.
And Olivier was the editor of a new English translation by Art Goldhammer, which was published a few years ago by University of Virginia Press.
Yeah, it's a wonderful translation. And what we did, we also did a biographic in the back of the book, a biographical dictionary of everybody who is mentioned, because otherwise you really don't know who he's talking about. 90% of those names have long been forgotten. So we actually went through the sources and added this biographical dictionary, which is really useful. But it took a very long time to publish the recollections. Tocqueville didn't want to have it published, to publish it in his lifetime. And then he didn't want to have it published until everybody he had mentioned was dead. It's actually a nephew who published it much later. And then he actually also made a lot of cuts. And so the first unabridged edition came out in 1942, actually, which is sort of amazing.
Robbie.
Yeah, it occurs to me, you mentioned the way you want to sort of frame perhaps Tocqueville as a man of action. And it occurs to me, perhaps this is obvious, but it just thought of it, that it really hooks up with his critique of the old regime nobility, that they weren't people of action. That is to say, they were sort of bought off by the crown, and he self-consciously wanted to sort of turn that around in his own lifetime, and asserting himself as a quintessential man of action, even though perhaps in terms of his personality, he wasn't disposed to that.
That's a very good point, actually. It's a very good point, because of course that is obviously the fact that the old nobility, that the privileges were no longer justified, it was frivolous. I mean, that's part of the whole explanation that he has of how the monarchy, by centralizing and bringing these people to court and abandon their local responsibilities, and there was no way they could justify their privileges. So that's very much part of the thing. It's a very good point. I hadn't really thought of it as ways in which he might depart from this model. But I'm sure there's something there. Yeah, obviously, that's a very good point.
The queue is open if you want to make comments or questions. I do want to add an element here to the list. So if there are some young scholars in the room here who might one day want to write on Tocqueville. There's been an inflation of translations of Tocqueville, 5 of them in the last 30 years. There's a lot of work being done on Tocqueville. So I'd like to ask all three of you, including Quang Yu, what are the underexplored aspects of Tocqueville's work? Because if you look at the Tocqueville bibliography, it seems like he's an overworked author, and it's very difficult to say anything new on Tocqueville's life or work. So what would you have to say about that? Are there any unexplored aspects? Listening to you, Olivier, I realize, and I sympathize with this perspective, that his correspondence, the 19 volumes of Œuvre Complète, are indeed a mine, a gold mine, for anyone who wants to understand that. But are there any other aspects of his work that are understudied?
Yeah, I really do think that, again, this idea is that, well, Tocqueville is a great mind, but his political life was a failure, so why do we have even to worry about it? It seems to me that I thought that, first of all, there are not that many successful politicians, and yes, he didn't become a great statesman, but he embraced some of the major issues of his generation, of his time. So I felt like for example, it's, I spent a fair amount of time trying to reconceptualize Tocqueville's support of the colonization project, because the line that has been, well, of course, how could he possibly be a colonizer and a Democrat? So there's a contradiction there, and so on and so forth. And of course, you can read it that way, and I think some of his support of the colonization of Algeria was not his best moments, especially condoning the extreme violence that took place in the conquest. But he viewed Algeria as a little bit like a French Far West, as a French Western expansion, as the ability for the French to get out of their mediocrity and do something with their life, and go there and have gaggles of kids and cultivate the land, and there was plenty for everybody. Now, it's really quite interesting that when you mentioned how the neocons during the Iraq War were reviving a Tocquevillian sort of impulse of let's fight mediocrity with a great project. I think there was articles in the press about this and all of this, so I think I try to recast some of that discourse by showing how you have to look at it in geopolitical terms, in the competition between France and England, in how could be, but Tocqueville was a man of contradictions, like most of us are. People of contradictions, and he didn't resolve them. So I think the way in which he wanted to be both an intellectual and a politician is of great significance in understanding Tocqueville, because it's not an abstract treatise on democracy. It's actually everything an unfinished piece of work. Think of democracy. He was he wrote it twice. Decided, well, need to do it again. So there is a movement. I mean, anyway.
Richard?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I agree. I concur that there was the sort of discovery of his checkered colonial past. I guess it was always known, but then it's become prominent in political science, political theory, intellectual circles. I agree with it that it's been cast in a certain way, and that's not entirely inaccurate, and certainly, like you say, not his best moment. But I think there are dimensions of it that are of broader interest than just, oh, he was a bad colonialist. Right, his vision, the way in which his vision might have also, if I understand it correctly, been informed by kind of Saint-Simonian idea of Republican virtue and agrarianism, right? Algeria qua America and the American colonies. So there's aspects of it that I think have been dropped out. Also in tome 3.1, no one's really done anything with his writings on India. They're more fragmentary. They're not as worked out as even the things he wrote about colonialism in Algeria. But I think there's still a project on Tocqueville in India, Tocqueville on Islam, his notes on the Quran. Alan Kahan has done some things, some chapters and some other work that references that material, but I think there's still things there to be explored. And I would just add something I'm fascinated by, and maybe is the flip side of the presentation I was just giving, but there's been much attention and much assumptions about Tocqueville's pedigree from a conservative vantage, Tocqueville of the right. And again, I do think that's an American fascination that in some manner stems from the disproportionate influence and reading of democracy in America. But once one delves into the material and the period that Olivier's been describing, there's also fascinating questions about Tocqueville's relationship to socialism. I think really in terms of his deeply, deeply ambivalent relationship to socialism, right? 1848 is in some way, this is socialism. There's the materialism of socialism, the idea, the base concern with economic distribution that he associates with socialism. It makes it, for him, some of the same ambivalence he has toward capitalism. And yet, right, there's something about the reform impetus, right? Some other aspects of socialism, and I think he does certainly find it appealing. So I think that Tocqueville is man of the left. I think there's still work to be done to reconstruct that aspect of his political trajectory and his political orientation. As you mentioned, he was engaged and deeply committed to any number of different reform-oriented left or left-ish political initiatives in his own time.
You know,
All of which failed. by the way.
Well,
yeah, but on this issue, though, Louis Blanc was a socialist. Wrote a remarkable review of democracy in America. Proudhon left extensive reading notes on democracy in America. And in the 1840s, Tocqueville read Saint-Simon, and he read Fourier, and he read Owen, and he make notes, extensive notes. What really turned him off was the violence in 1848, because Tocqueville really believed that democracy needed respect to the law. It couldn't function otherwise. That was one of the key fundamental prerequisite for democracy to function. And so when he saw the February Revolution come before others actually, and then the materialistic passions of socialism. When he felt that democracy not only needed law and order, but also spiritual life and reconciliation with religion, then he turned against socialism, and he said, "Don't even mention it. There's a real difference between democracy and socialism." There's one interesting moment in the biography that I discovered by total chance, is that in 1857, Tocqueville was in England to wrap up, to do some research on the regime, on the Ancien Regime book, and he wanted to look at papers in the British Library, in the British Museum, in the new reading room of the British Museum. And he spent time reading there in June of 57. And in June of 57, Karl Marx spent time reading in the same reading room in the British Museum, and they didn't meet, but they could have. Of course, Marx read Tocqueville, Tocqueville never read Marx. He read the other socialists, but Marx didn't read Tocqueville and left notes.
He never read Marx.
No, he never read Marx.
We know that.
I know that for sure, but Marx read Tocqueville.
Tocqueville had good taste, so.
Well, Marx was a fantastic writer,
Oh, yes.
a fantastic writer.
Between Tocqueville style and Marx style, I have no hesitation.
But you know, the fake is you should read the 18 Brumaire of Bonaparte, Marx on the coup, and the recollections of the 1848 revolution, Tocqueville, side by side. They are the same book. Their class analysis is exactly similar. It's a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable.
Actually, this prompts a larger question, which I'll give you in a moment, whether Tocqueville should be read as the anti-Marx or not, because that might detract from his value. So there's a temptation to look at Tocqueville as the anti-Marx, but maybe that's a wrong way of looking at it. Marco.
Oh, now that that's been said, my question.
And whatever you wish. I just wanted to add to the Marx.
What I'm trying to do is have one question that I think can be framed to each of the three of you very briefly. So then this could be, we could collect for once and then here. So the question is basically a specification of Aurelian's first question about like what's left to be done. And we went quickly in the direction of Algeria and coloniality, you know, the decolonizing of political philosophy, right? Post-coloniality, right? Like Tocqueville's a very important thinker there, it seems to me. Far beyond the question of, you know, what's sort of undeniable, which is own active support, not as a man of ideas, but as an active politician for the Algeria. I mean, of course, how could you not talk about Iraq? It's sort of bizarre, right? The way that Tocqueville gets spoken about, because the lesson of Tocqueville is, my God, what a horror, right? When a committed Democrat gets it in their head that it's a good idea to export democracy overseas, Tocqueville should be, you know, public evidence number one. But obviously that reckoning has never happened. It seems to me that that reckoning hasn't happened for all that sort of the awakening of Tocqueville literature to the question of colonialism has certainly happened. So under that general heading, I guess my question, so the specification of the question, I think we go this way, right, would be like thinking about China and the new authoritarianism, and I'd had like some vague idea about the long associations in particular had trickled into my world, but I really appreciated your presentation of them today. I think I understand it better, but do you suppose that some of it is that Tocqueville, I'm wondering if some of the reception has to do with the way that Tocqueville is an unapologetic French chauvinist, right, actually, which is maybe in conflict with other things we would associate with Tocqueville. Does that, in your estimation, or would you say that that's been resonating in China, which would be a sort of genuine Tocquevillianism of kind, right? Not the ideas maybe so much as the political action, right? That, as I understand it, very limited understanding, what gives the neo-authoritarian perspective such purchase right now, especially, is this sense that just as maybe 200 years ago, it was the contest between France and Britain that was going to decide the shape of world history. Right now, it's the contest between China and the US. And so let's be good Tocquevillians, which in this case means let's recognize that, like the French, we have to stand up to the British and put them in their place, which in this case would mean, right, we, the CCP, standing up to the Americans and their, you know, sort of imperialist barbarism that they dress, you know, in other clothes or something like that. Like that would be one specification. The specification to Olivier would be a version of the question that I asked you in May, if you wanted to take it up, which is, you know, in the book, I'm trying to recall my question from May, but like in the book, I think you delve into this in great detail. I mean, his speeches and his activism around the beginning, and really it's the beginning of the Algeria experience, right? This is really super important, I think, taking seriously your idea that we don't just think of this as an intellectual, but as a politician. It was by no means decided, right, that Algeria was going to be thought of as part of France, and that this 130-year, you know, experiment was going to last as long as it did and be as, you know, be as complicated and really revolting a history as it would be. You know, I think in the book, you make a really excellent case for the idea that there's a conflict, you know, and there's this common Tocquevillian pattern of, you know, of seeing both sides of something and having doubts, but that you, correct me if I'm wrong, what I think the account does is to kind of justify the not his best moment aspect of it in terms of his project in general of helping, you know, equality and liberty to converge the way that he theorizes that they do in some form, right? That in a mistaken impression of how the Algerian experiment could do that for the French, as well as for others, perhaps, but primarily for the French, he ends up kind of on the wrong, you can't say anything else, but on the wrong side of this. And I guess, you know, maybe for us to try to get this to the question is like, is it maybe easier to ultimately just sort of throw your hands up in the air and say that there isn't a salvageable version of the defense of the colonial enterprise if you really believe in the ultimate convergence of equality and liberty? Does that make sense? That in the book you try to show how, from Tocqueville's perspective at least, one could see that. And I'm just wondering if maybe that isn't ultimately a failed enterprise. And that would get me to your, like, could you say a bit more about the three the three chapters in the form that they are, and what are the three things that Tocqueville was just wrong about, and why it's really important to speak with him about them.
Kwangyu, would you like to start?
Yeah. And I think I have some thoughts about like responding to your different question in a set. So in general, I think the study of Tocqueville actually is a unlimited opportunities in two senses. First, when we look at Tocqueville, we always bring the question of our own age like into the reading. And when we have new circumstances, we have new political social challenges, we come up with some new perspectives. And if we bring that new perspective into reading Tocqueville, we will find something, maybe some new understanding of Tocqueville. So in this way, we created opportunity to interpret Tocqueville in new lights. Secondly, again, applying Tocquevillian ideas to analyzing our new conditions is also like unlimited opportunity. So I think in these two directions, we still have many things to do with the study of Tocqueville. And related to your question about like Chinese authoritarians and their interest in Tocqueville's imperialist colonial thought, I think that really makes sense. First, I want to like Wang Hunin's 1991 book, America Against America, doesn't have a proper conclusion, but he concluded it with a section on US and Japan. And look at how he concluded his whole book. He said that at that time, he thinks Japan is posing some challenges to United States economic dominance in the world. He said that like after the Second World War, America become prosperous because of its favorable historical and natural conditions. But only 30, 40 years later, I mean, at his time, American status have been like seriously challenged by Japan. It can be said that Japan is only the first nation that challenges America. In next century, there must be more nations that will pose challenges to United States. And by that time, American would start to reflect on their politics, economics, and culture. So he thinks that because American society has so many like tensions, conflicts, and if it lets these conflicts develop by themselves, its advantages will be diminished, and in the end, it will have a unstoppable trend to a big crisis. So you can see that like in this sense, first he thinks that America is undergoing a serious crisis, and secondly, you can see his not only authoritarian theory about regime development, but also kind of a Chinese nationalist sense of like what's the status of China in the future, and like American, China, and other big powers have this imperial competition in the next few decades. So these kind of ideas like connect into authoritarian thought there.
Do you mind if I take the first stab at the Algeria does not equal Iraq or does equal Iraq? So I think, I guess that's an empirical question, right? Looking at that from an outside vantage, maybe Algeria does look suspicious like Iraq, Iraq looks suspicious like Algeria, but why wouldn't, I take your question not to be that, the empirics of it, but to be why from the vantage of using Tocqueville, would people not recognize the moral or practical contradiction? And I think because maybe in the way Tocqueville thinks about it, there really is a different philosophical difference between the two of them. So Tocqueville's colonialism evolves over time, as people probably know. There's the 1837 letters where he is relatively idealistic, relatively optimistic. We're going to have there's conquest, but then we're going to have the arts and sciences, we're going to have trade and commerce, we're going to have colonization, we're going to have intermarriage, we're going to have a new kind of polyglot culture that emerges there. And he seems to think this is a realistic possibility. Then it doesn't transpire this way, right? The Algerians have very different views of all this. And at least by my reading, the justification shifts from bringing the arts and sciences and all these things to the Algerians to the grandeur, right? And the national interests of France. It's about us not being humiliated. It's about us doing something to inject energy into an otherwise lethargic bourgeois society. So I think that's it's ultimately a self-interested justification, whereas I take that to be different than at least the professed justifications and appeals to Tocqueville in the Iraq case, whereby it's much more the idealistic, whether you want to call it neoconservatism or liberal internationalism. It's us doing wonderful things for the Iraqis by bringing them a new government and writing a constitution for them and bringing all these blessings of liberty to them.
Just, I mean, if you listen to Cheney, it's not that. It's a matter of we've got to get away over the Vietnam syndrome.
Could be, maybe that was the,
I think
not even the great unsaid, but the said it out loud. They said the quiet part out loud. Yeah.
not to say that both were operative, and I think the
Right.
dominant one was let's create democracy. But
Yeah.
for Cheney and his ilk, it was something this was something. It's an obstacle in American foreign policy that we're burdened now with the sense of defeat, and it comes from Vietnam.
That seems exactly right. Although interestingly, that was not the way or the context in which Tocqueville was invoked by such folks. Anyway, that's just, sorry, just wanted to add that.
Olivier?
Well, you mentioned Tocqueville's unexplored work on India. Clearly, Tocqueville was really interested in India. He never really completed this work within the trip, but he left wonderful reading notes. He read James Mill, History of India, very closely, and then he left really interesting notes on L'Abbé Dubois and on the caste system. I think Dumont's, the anthropologist, book Homo Hierarchicus still is really the best analysis of Tocqueville's work on India. But interestingly, what really interested him in the colonial context is how the British managed to control India so easily, in a way, as opposed to the bloody conquest of Algeria, because what they needed was to control a handful of princes. And then when that was done, they could then control the country as a whole. I think Tocqueville, as a French chauvinist, yes, 100% of it, no question about it. And clearly, if you read the correspondence with John Stuart Mill, that the conflict erupts and at one point, Mill tells him, just don't be a schoolboy. I mean, just realize that the grandeur of a country is nothing to do with its power and its conquest, but how you develop civilization. And about this, there's no civilizing impulse in Tocqueville's imperialism. He thinks that, yes, there may be early on, yes, as you mentioned, this utopian view of the two societies merging, but that disappears pretty quickly. That disappears quickly. Really, what it becomes the colony of settlement. Yes, France cannot lose. That's French honor. But and if we lose, then the Brits are going to come in and take it anyway. So there's justification. But really, we need to, because the French army was not interested, Bugeaud, and was not interested in the colonizing part of it. That's what really Tocqueville wanted, and send settlers there. And when he visited Algeria, that's what he did. He visited settlers' villages and make notes about how they were doing and so on and so forth. So it was not a civilizing project. It was an expansionist project to create opportunities for the French. But so in 1830, Tocqueville's childhood friend went to Algeria to fight, and Tocqueville feared for his friend's life. Tocqueville's older brother, Hippolyte, wanted to go. He didn't go in the end, but he volunteered to go. There was a really consensus in France on the conquest. Louis Blanc, the socialist, said, we have Algeria, we want to keep it for us forever. From left to right, there was a real consensus. That doesn't necessarily. Okay. One other thing I want to say is that by the 50s, we realized he was wrong. And he was in England in the Sepoy Rebellion. And he told his British friends, "Holy, no, he didn't succeed in limiting the aggressive retaliation. The Sepoy Rebellion did okay. Could never really do what we did in Algeria." And he retrenched in the 50s from his colonial position, something that is really not recognized.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. What is in the biography?
Please go ahead. There's a question in the chat that we'll take and then we'll conclude. Go ahead.
So I'll preface my question, Mark, by saying that I didn't read the books, and I read Democracy in America at some point when I was in law school a couple of times. And so I have very limited knowledge. But going back to the question that you asked about, how do we reconcile these this tension, the support of colonialism and this way that he described democracy and equality and justice in life. And I guess I'm struggling to see the distinction between the example that you posed between Iraq and Algeria. I mean, whether you're importing arts and sciences or democracy or whatever the case may be, there is still reflects, some of the problems with the colonialist project. I mean, I think some of the logics there are white supremacist logics, the idea, or nationalist, logics in terms of why you're a superior society that can then import whatever it is that you need to import onto another society. And I guess, with Tocqueville and others, I think some of the questions that you pose don't really get sufficiently examined. And I just wanted to flag that as an outsider, I still see some of the tension that you're raising. And I mean, one explanation could be maybe not everyone is imagined as being a participant of the democracy that he was describing. And I think it's plausible.
Quick response, again, as Professor Zunz said, Tocqueville's position on colonization in Algeria is nuanced and changed over time. I think one message I read is that he really wants to learn from, copy the American experience of expansion. So, and he modeled French colonization in Algeria on this American model. And when he found that this didn't work, like the civilians settlement in Algeria is not going to have any effect, he then think this is not interesting to him anymore. And that's part of it. So, and also related to how to read democracy in America, how to read America's experience. It's about America, American democracy. It's also about American expansion, American empire. And I think in that way, these different messages can affect different readers in different contexts, such as how Chinese authoritarians want to get out of democracy in America.
You want to address the question in the chat as well? So because it's linked to centralization, and David Selby asked the question.
Yeah. So I think the key is that, yeah. I have a question for Mr. Zhao. One of the great warnings in the old regime is that centralization itself was one of the causes of the revolution, and especially of the radicalism of the revolution. Centralization combined with representative institutions, such as English example, can be done. Without these institutions, then a violent revolution can become much more likely during the transitionary phase. Is the French example. So do you see this sense of this moral in the Chinese literature? It's a warning for Xi, but maybe although the CCP is still interesting to think about a representative institution. So it's worth noting that clearly describe the treatment of Native Americans in the United States.
Different part, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's my point. I think both Ci Jiwei and Chongmin's analysis of Chinese politics nowadays, they apply so-called equality of condition, this category, to analyze the transformation of Chinese society in the reform era. they both, I think, neglected the problem of centralization, like because China is, for Tocqueville wrote something about China, not very good words, but he said that like it's extremely centralized regime, and which actually like stifles the free spirit in the society. It's kind of a paradigm of lack of freedom under equality. So I think that's also the case here, and which I want to use to apply to analyzing Chinese politics nowadays. Because if you look at how the party regimes centralized apparatus, so not only long efficient, but also demoralizing the society itself. It has caused many like moral problems for the Chinese society. I think if we go into that direction, we can have some new perspectives about how Chinese politics will develop in the future. So in that sense, yes, I think if Chinese current regime under Xi keeps on this centralization trend without like opening some venues for grassroots participation, grassroots input from the society. If they think that they as a smart planner can solve everything in Chinese society, I think they are going to that end there. So I think some political scientists already point out that problem, and I think we can also bring Tocqueville's perspective.
I'd like to give chance to other speakers to make some final remarks, Richard, and then we'll finish with Olivier. Very brief, so that.
Yeah, just again, I'm not sure that this will be a fully satisfactory answer to the issue of colonialism with a distinction versus difference, but I guess I'm sympathetic to your critique, your objection that whether one nation is occupying another nation toward the ostensible benefit of the occupied nation, or whether it's occupying it in a way that is unapologetically extractive, we're still occupying another nation, right? And so there is a certain kind of power and a certain kind of violence that's being done. So maybe in practice, I guess I'm with you in practice that colonialism is in some sense colonialism, but I guess the issue in the 19th century and the issue with respect to interpreting Tocqueville is that Tocqueville's initial and eventually Mill's position that despotism is justified so long as and only so long as it's for the improvement of the nation that's being conquered and the means are actually affecting that end. There is, I guess, a kind of idealistic aspiration, and there is a kind of auto-critique, an immanent critique that's built into that justification, as opposed to the opposite position that Tocqueville sort of ends up in, where we're really not here for the Algerians. There's no pretense here. We're just here for the French and for French interests. And if that ends up harming, brutalizing, burning the people of Algeria, then so be it. So again, I'm not, this is not an apology for better and worse forms of colonization, but I think from an intellectual justificatory standpoint, there is at least ostensibly a difference. And then just one last thought, I think David Selby brought up something here. If one wants to talk about contradictions, very quickly, the contradictions within Tocqueville's corpus, I really do in some sense fault him for not connecting the dots between 1835, First Democracy, where he talks about what happened to the Native Americans. And there he says, it is inevitable whenever one or quote unquote more civilized people comes in contact with the less civilized people, the less civilized people acquire the vices, none of the virtues and advantages of civilization. So it is explicitly a nihilistic argument. And it's one that sort of elides more responsibility too. This just happens. This is just how civilization works. Step back, gasp, tragedy. He doesn't seem to draw that connection or connect the dots in terms of his treatment of Algeria, because 2 years later, then he's saying, oh, but we'll just go to Algeria and we'll trade with them, we'll engage in commerce, right? And everything will work out and they'll be improved by this. Like, why would that not result in the same result it resulted in for the Native Americans? I've always been very, in terms of his contradictions, intellectual contradictions, I've always been bothered by his failure to connect those two dots. So I think David Selby is exactly right to point us to that. Sorry, that was more than a minute.
Olivier?
I think Tocqueville's positions on the Native Americans, that somehow he he thought they were doomed. No matter what. And so he kind of gave up on them. Even though he felt that very strongly, he witnessed Native Americans 3 different times during the trip, and it's worth spending a couple of minutes in that. First time, it was in upstate New York, and they were inebriated, and they were asking for alms, and he had this sort of Rousseauist image of the noble savage in his head, and he was really disappointed and upset to see the degradation. And then he crossed the Michigan forest with Indian guides and went on the road to the Great Lakes and visited those islands, and he saw Native Americans still in their sort of traditional circumstances and habitat. He reconciled with them in so many ways. And then he went down the Mississippi River and he saw the early moments of the Trail of Tears with the Choctaw crossing the Mississippi with the forced migration. And he was very, very disturbed by this. So, but in the end, it's sort of gave up. There's a sense of doom. There's nothing we can do. And so I think, so in a way, on the other hand, he saw very clearly that unless there was some drastic change in the country, there would be a race war, because the treatment of African Americans could not last indefinitely, and right. So that was that. He was lived in the nation. I mean, Hobsbawm wrote 2 great books, Eric Hobsbawm, The Age of Empires, The Age of Extremes. And so I think Tocqueville was The Age of Empire, but rejected The Age of Extremes. And one thing I will say is Tocqueville's controversy with Gobineau in the 50s. It's really interesting because there he came out for the equality of men regardless, in a very strong statements. So in a sense, it's interesting chronologically to see how this also coincided with his change of mind regarding colonialism. And so he really wanted to the end of his life, to retreat from those positions. And I think the historiography should recognize it more, even though I'm not here to take his side or anything like that, but that's just part of the process.
There's nothing wrong with taking his sides or criticizing his ideas, because in many ways he remains a lively author for us. We don't have to turn him into the patron saint of democracy. He's there to watch us. He's inspiring us in many ways to do better than him, because that's our task. But I think what we can take from this wonderful panel today, for which my thanks is to you and to the panelists, is the idea that democracy remains a work in progress. And we are all invited to write a better book than Democracy in America, a better one than the Old Regime Revolution. So the invitation is open and the challenge is up for you. Please join me in giving a round of applause. Want to talk to our guests? We have some